where it all begins.
Good evening, class.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Glad to see that most of us are here, and it's the second week of our time together in 581 strategic approach or systems approach to strategic planning. And we had an active week one, and well done to everyone who participated in the discussion. So we'll get started this evening and go from there. Before I get into the new material, does anyone have any questions in regards to either the class discussion last week or any of the reading that you may have come up during the week? Any questions? Okay, then we'll just move right along. All right. One of the things we find in reviewing organizations, and we look at their involvement in strategic planning as a concept, is we try to determine whether or not quantitatively we can justify all of the time and effort that we put into strategic planning. And what we find is that when you evaluate companies based on their activity and their performance, that the highly successful organizations that that's main driving force is strategic planning, that use a routine periodic process to approach strategic planning, that those high performing companies are 74% of the culture of the business world. So the ones that are the highest performers, 74% of them are active strategic planners. Whereas the low success organizations, the main driving being risk and challenge and dealing with the risk assessment and minimizing risk, we find that the vast majority of those organizations are low performers, and their performance in the marketplace is relatively low as compared to the ones that use strategic planning. And so, for that reason, it would appear that one of the measures of a success factor of what it takes to be an effective organization and be successful in the marketplace today is the activity of strategic planning. Typically, there are two components of organizational strategic planning. We talked a little bit last week about the fact that we start out in the beginning in the development phase, and we try to understand the needs and expectations of the marketplace. We try to determine what our customer base expects from us for success. We try to determine what our competitors are doing and what the the losers and winners are doing, so that we can develop a strategic approach to the marketplace. Once we've established that strategic plan, which many companies spend a great deal of time and money accomplishing, it represents a relatively small portion of the total strategic planning process, because you then have to go into what we call the deployment or implementation phase of strategic planning. And that's when we actually put the feet to the ground and actually carry out all of the expectations and theories that we established during the development phase. Development refers to the creation, updating, and approaches of strategic planning. Development is taking all the ideas and the theories that we developed during that strategic assessment and applying them factually in the workplace. Development typically includes identifying and documenting the entire strategic planning process. Often this will be based on a strategic planning model tailored to the organization's needs. So there are many organizations out in the marketplace that are selling software and strategic models that are used to develop a business approach. And then what we do is we customize that for our individual business needs. Outlining participants and their responsibilities is another factor that we do in the development phase. We sit down and figure out who all are the different stakeholders in the strategic application process. Those can be different parts of our workforce. They can be supervisory, middle management, executive management. It could be our vendors. It can be our customers. It could be the government entities that we deal with. It could be trade associations. It could be educational institutions that we have research and development contracts with. So all of those elements have to be outlined and identified, and the responsibilities that each of those elements have to the success of the strategic planning process are also identified. Identify the sources of input and the types of analytics needed or used. So where do we get, based on what this strategic model that we've come up with, we need to identify what the inputs are to that model from either within or outside the organization. They're going to provide the data and the information and the processes that we need to be able to be successful in launching that strategic plan. We also have to identify the analytic tools that we're going to use for each of those different applications and elements of the strategic plan. As we talked about last week, strategic planning requires you to have quantitative measurements and ways of measuring success in such a way that you can tell as you're moving through the process whether you're moving down the right path and whether or not you're achieving the expectations that you need to be successful in the total plan. And then showing the timeline, the linkages of other planned processes, both internal and external. So part of the taking that strategic plan and moving it into a development phase is validating and figuring out what's the timeline for each of these activities and the sequential elements that are going to occur and what's going to follow what. And then the other part of it, of course, is understanding all of the other related plans and processes that are inputs or outputs to the strategic plan, both from an internal and external standpoint. So that might be your research and development plan. It might be your marketing plan or your sales plan. It might be your human resource development plan. All of those other types of activities that a company often generates we have to tie those schedules and those plans into the strategic plan to make sure that they're not in conflict and to ensure that resources are being allocated properly. Then as far as developments or activities in the implementation plan, the development tasks include deploying to all the appropriate levels. So you have in the strategic implementation plan and development plan, you actually develop a model as to how you're going to communicate the strategic plan to your organization, and in what sequence and in what timing and in what order, and what the individual message will be to those groups. So, for example, you would sit down and develop: are we going to first inform the manufacturing group before we do the sales group? Or if we're doing the manufacturing group, are we going to do it as a plant briefing? Are we going to break it down into department briefings or work cells or work centers? How are we going to deploy that strategy into the organization? Are we going to notify the accounting department before we notify the manufacturing department, or simultaneously? All of that's as part of the development process. Prioritizing the work and resources. The development and deployment plan is the place where we sit down and we prioritize which factors or work elements of the schedule are going to come first. And if we have a resource allocation issue where we have to, say, apply, and a good example would be if you were launching technology in your strategic plan that required you to use your engineering resources, and you had limited engineering resources, then you would have to prioritize the strategic launching of the new technology versus the maintenance and maintaining of the existing technology, and how you're going to allocate resources and prioritize resources to meet all the various objectives of the organization. So that's part of the plan as well. Middle managers translating strategic to operational. Last week we talked about the fact that the strategic plan is what upper and senior management normally focuses on. But when you start getting down into the manufacturing or the operational level of the organization, you get more concerned about communicating the operational plan rather than a strategic plan. And the strategic plan being the big picture objectives that you're trying to achieve. The operational plan is that day-to-day activity that the worker or the work cell or the department is accomplishing on a day-to-day basis. Now, it's going to be guided and directed by the strategic intent of the organization, but they're really dealing with, how many widgets are we going to make today, and in what order or what sequence. And so the middle management has to be able to translate that big picture strategic view into an operational view for the purposes of the rank and file. And then establishing project plans for activities. A strategic plan is in a real sense is like a macro plan that's at a relatively high level of detail. When you start getting into the process of implementing that plan in the deployment, you have to start thinking of the micro elements of the project. And the way we normally do that is we take the strategic plan, break it up into its component parts, and then we establish project plans using project management techniques to implement and carry out the necessary activities that we're going to do to accomplish the strategic plan. And so upper and middle management gets involved in designing project plans for various activities that need to be carried out for the strategic plan to be successful. And part of that, and if you look at the DMAIC process, you could be easily misinformed to think that review, monitoring, and control is the final phase in the process, when in fact it really isn't. It's something that takes place throughout the process. We show it in the DMAIC process as a step toward the end, but that's not really what goes on. We actually do review, monitoring, and control throughout all phases of a project. And so as you develop that strategic plan, you've got to develop the tools and the methods that you're going to use to review, monitor, and control the project at each step. And that's going to be things like gatekeepers, events, project timelines, desk tracking reports, and so forth that are going to show benchmarking capabilities, showing when things are supposed to get done and at what timeline. And then you track against those to ensure that you're making proper process control and process timing. Tracking results falls into that same part of monitoring and control. We establish timelines and indicators and critical points, and we try to establish in that development project the timeline that we expect to see certain segments accomplished, and then we track against that and report back to management. The tracking of those elements is what allows us to ensure that we're staying on task. And then linking performance goals and objectives. Too often, companies establish a strategic plan and a strategic intent, and then develop a development plan, and they don't go to the next step of tying those deliverables into the performance goals and objectives of the divisions, departments, or the individuals, especially in the management level. If the strategic plan is critical to the success of the company and the development plan is critical to ensure it's achieved, then leadership and management should have at least some part of their performance evaluation tied directly to the deadlines and deliverables of that project. And too often, we establish all this good information and we never tie the performance reviews of leadership and management into them. And then we wonder why we're not successful in launching our strategic plans. And it's because we aren't holding people accountable and we're not measuring it. Communicating and engaging stakeholders. We tend to do a very effective job in the planning phases of strategic planning to talk and interview stakeholders. But where we fail is as we move through the process, the communication vehicles that are used to keep the stakeholders informed break down. People get busy with the day-to-day activity and reaching the objectives, and they often forget to keep the stakeholders informed. They will often keep the sponsors and the executives informed, but they represent only a percentage or a portion of the stakeholders. One of the biggest things that companies fail in, and students doing these projects fail in, is identifying who all the stakeholders are and ensuring they address the needs of those stakeholders, and then keep those stakeholders educated and informed of where they're at. That may require a project manager to meet with the stakeholders on a regular basis and give them a verbal or a semi-formal presentation as to the status of the project and how it specifically implements or impacts them. When we go through the strategic planning process, we identify the stakeholders and we identify the expectations and wants of those stakeholders. So when we come back to give feedback, we should be using those same documents to ensure that our feedback to the stakeholders as we go through the project address those specific things. We often, if we do go back, we often just go back and give a generic report that we give to everybody, and we fail to go back and key in on that stakeholder inventory that we established during the development phase. And that is one of the areas where people often fail. Okay, so then once we've done that establishment phase and we've done all that communication and we've got a process engaged, we then need to establish the process, what we call the development phase. And so in the development phase, we start to show the steps to be used. So we actually itemize and lay out usually a process map that shows exactly the steps that we're going to go through to carry out the development. We tailor it, those steps and those organizational structures to the needs of the organization. There's no such thing as a cookie cutter process that we can use. Each company is going to be different. We provide roadmaps of the entire process and the big picture process to the organization And while those will get broken up into work cells and into the individual departments, they should at the highest level show the process throughout the whole organization. Provide bias for improvement. So we should be working on the fact as we're going through the development phase, we should always be looking at ways that we can improve the process that we may not have caught when we originally did the assessment. And we want to make sure that we are constantly asking participants for advice on ways in which the process could be improved. And we can often incorporate those on the fly into our plan as we find things that we might not have recognized in the beginning. We associate with the model and our standard terms of for all planning elements. So we want to make sure we use consistent terminology throughout the entire process. Things like vision, mission, statement, goal, objectives are all standard terms that we need to use consistently through the various levels of a strategic plan. So your vision statement needs to be the same throughout all of your documents. And so does the missions, the strategy, the goals, and the objectives. Quite often, companies will start getting into the weeds, and they'll tweak these items to work for the individual department. And when you do that, then you can't tie it back to the original plan. So we encourage you to make sure that when you build these models, that you keep them the same and consistent. The development and implementation phase is best utilized and accomplished by using project management methodology for the strategic process. So some of the tools you learned in project management should be used consistently throughout the whole strategic planning process, and that involves doing the process mapping, showing the process by using process maps, establishing timelines, milestones, deliverables, holding the organization accountable for accomplishing those milestones, and using the models to show progress. And we often use color coding or pointers to show exactly how we're moving through the process. So, for example, this is the map we've been using to show the process that we're using in this strategic planning process. And as you can see, in this particular case, we've used red to indicate the strategic process, and gray is the implementation process. And we're using these outlines to show segmented groups of work that are done in tandem. in tandem. So the red here, we're using color as far as the development phase, and gray for the implementation phase. And that's what I'm talking about when we often develop these tracking documents and we try to use color or graphics to simplify keeping the organization informed as far as where we are in the process. Okay, I'll take a breather for a minute. Anyone have any questions so far about the comments that I've made so far? Are these terminologies and methodologies that you're seeing used currently either in your business or in your project companies that you're working with?
This is Edgar. For Cameron and I could say that unfortunately we don't get exposure to a lot of these because a lot of the projects and strategic planning is held by specific groups or kaizens. And so because of the current workload that we have, it lessens the chance or odds of us even being part of the group that would handle any of these.
Okay, so the organization you're in is not even if they may be using it, but they're not publicizing it to the level that the general employees would be aware of the process.
Kind of like how you mentioned before that it is more so at the top levels, but it does flow down to the production level, and we're kind of told, okay, this is what's going to happen, but we're not. It's been kind of difficult to maintain constant communication of any changes or updates to those plans, especially because we have, at least currently in our current form, because we have a whole lot of other one we have a couple of projects that have most of the that are carrying the higher amount of the workload, and it's most of the attention is being put on that. So it
Mm.
kind of varies depending on what's going on around the site.
Yeah, it's not uncommon, especially in companies that have resource issues, for a major project, say to launch a new database or a new IT system or a new technology, that it will overwhelm the organization and suck up the resources, even though they had a plan to do otherwise. They just get overwhelmed by the priorities of the business. Uh, One of the things that we tell companies that are investing the time in strategic planning is that they need to have a communication vehicle that keeps the whole organization informed, even if they're not involved in the day-to-day process. Because if nothing else, it creates a positive environment for when the organization realizes that leadership at least has a plan. So the fact that they're not taking that effort, uh, while it's not critical, it would a person coming in doing an assessment of them would likely give them the feedback that they need to develop some type of a communication mechanism to inform everybody of what's going on. And I don't mean that as a criticism. I'm just saying that's normally what they would be told. Okay. All right. So this is just an example of a strategic model. It happens to be one I believe we looked at to some degree last week. And this pyramid represents the process that we go through. And the vision obviously is at the top of the organization. That's normally done by the executive level or of the organization. And then the mission statement's built on the vision statement, as is the goals. And you normally see the strategic planning process is those top four pyramids of the pyramid, steps of the pyramid, the gray. And those are normally carried out by senior management or executive management within an organization, depending on the size of the company. And then the action plan, the work that's accomplished to actually achieve that strategic plan, is the white platforms that you see at the bottom, and those are the efforts that are done to carry it out. So the gray is kind of the dreaming, and here's where we think we ought to be, and the white is putting that to action. The other thing that this shows is, if you notice, it's got questions up on the right-hand side. So, for example, under the vision, in the vision, we're identifying future state and implications, and where's the organization going? Those are the kind of questions we're trying to answer. In the vision statement, we're validating the organization's purpose and function, and we're answering the question why the organization exists. And so when you read these very cryptic mission statements that are trying to accomplish too much or have too many words in them, you often do not see them answering this question. A good mission statement is answering the question, why does the organization exist? The goals define the prioritization of broad direction of where the organization is going, and it answers the question, what does it look like when we are there? So the goals are the things you're going to try to achieve when you reach that point that the mission and vision statement have said you're heading toward. And so they also allow you to define the fact that you know you got there, that we've arrived. And what happens over time is those goals will normally evolve as you start achieving success. The objectives develop specific targets and activities, and the first level of the objectives is normally how. How are we going to achieve it? To achieve the goals and the vision. And so those are the questions that leadership is attempting to answer, and the information that they're attempting to communicate to the organization. Actions and initiatives are the tactical level responsibilities. They're the activities and the schedules that we're going to tactically carry out to achieve the objectives. And then the implementation is the execution management from a performance-based standpoint. So how are we going to execute and manage the strategic plan and measure it from a performance-based standpoint? So that's what this diagram is attempting to communicate. Here's a model of the process that you will normally see an organization go through as it's trying to be a strategic management organization. In the left-hand side over here, this is the information. This is what occurs before we start the strategic process, or at the beginning of the strategic process. So we complete a strategic analysis. That's an audit of the organization and the industry that you reside in. And then the stakeholders' objectives, and that involves all the different levels of stakeholders that are involved in an organization. Then the complete internal analysis, which is the organizational profile, strategic survey, and the business segmentation. So how is the company divided, or should it be divided? And what is the organizational profile? The strategic survey is trying to determine how the organization is currently structured, how they currently think, how they currently believe they perform. The complete external analysis is the assessment of the industry that you operate within, your key customer survey and how they feel about not only your organization but the industry as a whole, and then the competitive analysis, where you're actually assessing your competitors, their strengths and weaknesses. We often do a SWOT analysis as best we can on each of the competitors in a market. If we're entering a new market in our strategic plan, then we also try to do a competitive analysis and a key customer survey and an industry survey based on that new industry as well. Once we've completed that pre-planning phase, we then move into the planning phase that's in the center of the chart. And that's where leadership starts taking that data and creating or modifying to create a vision framework. What is the vision we see of the future? Where's the organization? Where's the industry going? This is the place at which we then would, at a high level, do a SWOT analysis and key issue assessment of the organization with the mindset that we're trying to determine what are our strengths and weaknesses and what will allow us to be successful and where are the areas where we need to improve. We then determine strategic choices. What are the choices we have? We don't necessarily yet have to decide what we're going to do, but we're trying to determine what choices we have, and then define the critical success factors and the SMART goals for the organization. And we'll talk about SMART goals later in the course. But that's the planning phase. And in that phase, senior management is now taking the raw data from the pre-plan and they're implementing it in or building it into a core of a strategic plan. And then once that's done, we move into the implementation phase. That's where we develop the scorecards that we're going to use to measure. So we're trying to create assessment methodology. We're going to talk and define how we're going to change the business. What are the things that about the business that we need to change? We're going to talk about how do we need to run the business differently? Or do we need to change the way the business operates? We then document the action plans and create action plans for how we're going to implement that strategic plan. And then we develop a communication plan, which is designed to teach and inform the organization of where they're heading and what their obligations are under the plan. And when they talk about meeting calendar, they establish a structured communication platform or program where they're going to actually go out and verbally inform the organization of the mission and of the strategic plan. You'll see in many large companies, the president or CEO will go and they'll actually be part of that presentation, and they'll go around to the different locations and different divisions and present the strategic plan. All of that top segment is a high-level process map of the strategic planning methodology. And then what you see at the bottom of this slide are the follow-up activities that are going to take place during the development and implementation segment where they're actually implementing the strategic plan. And you're going to have a monthly review process. That's normally going to be a reporting system that moves up the organization that lets them know where they're at in the process. And that's normally then rolled up into a quarterly assessment, which will normally have key indicators, financial in nature or key milestone in nature. Your annual review is a roll up of the quarterly. All three of those are done on a round loop basis, with the idea being that you're looking for trends, you're looking to ensure that you're continuing to make progress through the process. And then the training and development project element of it is best practices, internal strategic management, getting people certified in certain qualifications that you've identified they need. So what you do as part of your ongoing implementation strategy is you've got to figure out the types of skill sets that you need to bring into the organization, the training you need to achieve and give your people, and then tracking it to ensure you reach those training objectives. So this is not by any means the only approach that can be used. As the slide says, it's an example, but it's kind of a simplistic approach to showing you what a strategic process would look like in a standard organization. Any questions about that model? Okay. This is then a strategic map of a classic type project that's being implemented at the operational level. And what they've done here is if you'll notice, they've created swim lanes for the various processes within the company. And what they're doing is they're showing the activities and how they interact in the process of implementing a strategic activity within a company. So financial perspectives, they're talking about improving cost structure, increasing asset utilization. So these are buzzwords within the finance community of activity that's designed to give long-term shareholders value. And so you basically look at this whole thing as building up, if you notice the arrows. So you've got learning and growing perspectives. Whoops, sorry. You've got the area of culture, leadership, alignment, and teamwork. You've then got lay over the top of that human capital, information capital, and organizational capital. And what we're doing is we're building up and teaching people how to do teamwork, how to align their activities so that the organization's leading toward consistent goals, development of leadership, and the development of the culture. And all of that then leads up into the internal perspectives. Operational management processes, customer management processes, innovation processes, regulatory and social processes. And then these are activities that are accomplished in each of these areas. So under operational, we're developing supply processes, production processes, distribution processes, and risk management. And as you develop the culture of doing these types of process improvements in operations, then it feeds up into this customer perspective, for customer value perspective up here on the top layer. And what we're trying to do is develop processes that improve our functions in each of these areas: safety and health, environment, employment, and community. As you do all these things, you then see results in the area of price, quality, availability, selection, function, service, partnership, and brand. And these all then add up and create value in these four categories here. So what they're just trying to show you here is the Norton philosophy of, if you design your process map, and divide your functions within your company into this kind of a structure, you can then track the value add of your process to the point where you understand how you're creating value. Now, this one happens to be for whatever company they were designing this for. If you were doing it for your company, you might have slightly different processes in each of these boxes, but they're going to be similar in nature. And all this, what they're trying, stupid mouse, what they're trying to do here is in these charts is just show you that companies design these kind of visual slide presentations to be able to show their organizations and their investors and their bankers and their customers how they're looking at their processes. And this, you're not going to have one that looks just like this. This is just an example of one that you might develop. And what you're trying to do is move from the functionality and growth and operational role of your business and evolve it toward customer satisfaction, which ultimately leads to financial improvement and perspective. And then productivity tends to be this, and this chart happens to be this side of the chart, and the growth of the strategy tends to be on this right-hand side. So the functions on those sides tend to feed in that direction. Does everybody understand that this chart's not literal? It's just an example of one you might develop to show your process and how you're improving your process. Any questions on the chart? Okay. Here's another example of another type of or methodology you could use to show a strategic map. In this case, they're using a slightly different structure. They're talking again. You see the objectives, the measurements, and what they've done is they've placed their organizational capacity over here, the internal process here, and the customer stakeholders here. So again, if you go back and look at the previous one, they're using similar categories that we used here. They're just presenting it in a slightly different way. And they're talking about the strategic statements, the key actions, the gap resolutions, targets, measures, and objectives. So this is a kind of a balanced scorecard type of an approach. And again, all I'm trying to show you here is that almost every business eventually develops something like this to try and show how their process works. And you can use these slides to come back and look at it and see how you can express it for your purposes. Okay, and then as far as, again, the process, institutionalizing the process and trying to get it so that your organization, it's embedded within your organization. When we institutionalize our strategic planning process into our company, it allows us to make it repeatable and part of the culture. And that's why they tend to try and create these charts. The below diagram reflects our strategic planning process accomplished every other year. The following will trigger interim review. So this is an example of a sheet that a company might make to show their people to try and explain the process. And what they're doing is they're showing in these arrows, similar to what we use for the DMAIC process. They're doing conducting environmental scan, developing planning guidance, conducting strategic plan, conducting independent audit review, develop action plan, align and budget, and execute review and performance. And then close loop, they come back to this end. So this is, again, an example of where a company is trying to express how their culture is going to institutionalize their strategic process. They've also applied a timeline to show when this process takes place and who within the organization is the champion for each segment. So in the pre-planning segment, they're saying the operation division with outside contractors is responsible for doing this element. And then in the planning, it's the top team operational facilitators and middle management. And then the post-planning, which is the budgetary and alignment in this case, they're saying it's the CFO and the operational heads. So this is just, again, an example. They're saying they're planning assessment changes, when they're going to have significant changes in the assessment and assignment mission. They're trying to explain the operational environment. And again, they're using this to teach their organization how a strategic plan is going to be implemented through their organization. And here's another one, again, trying to show you what they might look like. This is one that I've actually seen many companies actually use. The only thing I've seen a little bit different is I've seen inputs and I've seen outputs down here at the bottom. But what they're trying to do here is, again, they're showing the tasks across the top that they're going to go through, and then they show the activities that take place during that task. Here they're showing what the output is. The output here becomes the input to 2. So at task 1, the environmental scan, the interview guide, and the environmental scan is what's going to come out as the output. They're telling you that's going to be done in June and July. That then becomes an input to task 2. They go through these various activities, and then the output becomes these items down here, which becomes the input then to task 3, and it goes through the balance of the process. So again, this is not something you have to. This is not intended to be something for you to memorize, but what it's intended for you to understand is that in the process of doing a strategic and on tactical operation, at some point when you've completed the planning phase of it and you decide how your organization is going to put one together, there should be a document like one of these that's sitting out there for everyone to understand exactly how the process is going to take place, when it's going to take place, and what's missing from here is who's responsible. So they really, what they really should have at the bottom down here is who is the champion for each of these tasks. That's the only thing I could see here that's missing. Can you see by looking at these various examples why these would be important to an organization that's trying to do a strategic plan? I'll assume yes. Okay. So again, this chart, as we've been talking about previously, shows this traditional strategic planning model that companies go through. And what we've been talking about this evening, for the most part, has been this area right here, primarily in the pre-planning and organizational gap. So the various components we've been talking about in the mapping is occurring in this phase right here. Okay, so the pre-planning activity, in particular, just to regather that, meets with the client and the champion leader. So during this, what we're going to do is we're going to recap exactly what goes on here. So in that phase, you're meeting with the clients, champions, and the leadership. If you're the strategic planning coordinator or project manager that's driving the exercise, you're going to meet with those elements at this point. You're going to determine the needs and outputs for the strategic plan. What is it they anticipate and want? You're going to determine if the strategic plan is an appropriate approach, if it is more about the team's building or solution, some other type of plan may resolve providing those recommendations. So you're going to decide whether or not the strategic planning model is the right approach. You're going to determine the starting point, such as vision, mission, value, and make sure that the ones they have are okay, or that you need to develop them if they don't exist. Need to work on the strategies and the goals and objectives. You're going to determine constraints and key points to cover. So, for instance, no additional resources available for the next X months, 12 months. So if your sponsor or champion tells you that they need a strategic plan that does not add resources, that would be a constraint that you would capture at this point. Must align with higher headquarter plans, might be another constraint. Needs to address certain issues. They might say it needs to address new technology, the entry of a new competitor. Plans must be in place prior to a given date. So these would be the kind of constraints that you would gather. In the pre-planning phase, one of the documents that the team lead develops is a constraint document. And that's anything and everything he hears or she hears that could constrain the process. Cover the strategic planning model, the one that you're planning to use. the steps and process, and obtain agreement from the champion and from the leadership that that model will suffice for your business, including how it will be done, and giving a concise example of how you anticipate carrying out the project. So those maps we were showing, something to that effect, to get started anyway. And then determine the strategic planning team, their role, and other contributors. So normally there's a team put together, or a project team, who's responsible for the strategic planning process, who, even though it may be leadership that's driving it, usually there's a project manager or team that is carrying it through the process and managing and training the people that are involved in the project. So at this point, you'd want to get buy-in for that, for those memberships and the resources that are being committed to the project. Now, what you should notice by looking at this screen momentarily is that much of what was accomplished here is what most of your teams did in the very beginning when you started working with your champion and your sponsor. These are the steps and activities that you carried out for the most part. You may have used different words for them, but it's a very similar process to what you did when you were creating your projects. You will also discuss the level of effort and expected times available of leaders, of leaders and participants. So, how much of the resource are going to be able to use? Which people are going to be full time? Who's going to be part time? How often will the sponsor and leaders be available to participate in the process? You're going to cover the very high level discussion on a communication plan and the activities needed to support the plan, so that you have an understanding and expectation of what they want. You're going to cover who will be coordinating the point of contact for support, interviewing, and logistic consideration. So who has the authority to act on behalf of the organization to implement the strategic planning process. Discuss your role, for example, if you're the process or the team lead, overall designer, coordinator, senior level advisor, primary persons conducting the assessments or coordinator, facilitator of the sessions, or point of contact for third parties who do work for, are doing work for the organization. Those are all examples of the type of role you might have. It's critical that whoever is the project lead at the beginning of the project understands specifically what their role is, and then develop a project plan for the strategic planning offering, outline efforts outlining which when each step should occur, how it will be accomplished, and outline deliverables. So the element that completes the pre-planning phase is this strategic project plan, which would then be approved by leadership for the purpose of authorizing the team to move forward with the timeline and have the commitment of the organization and an understanding of what the deliverables are. So these are the pre-planning activities that should take place at the beginning of a strategic planning process. They are intentionally very similar to what we do for a traditional PMI project management or new project startup activity. Are these consistent with the activities that you saw either in your BBP or the way your company operates with these kind of projects? Anyone? Is this what you and your team did basically when you got started on your BBP?
Hey, sir, this is Sam Taylor. Yeah,
Yeah.
this looks exactly like what we did.
Yeah, we did. Did you find it beneficial?
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Good. Okay. So, this becomes more of a recap at this point in the project, but I think it's critical that what we're trying to basically show here is that when you start doing a strategic plan, you follow a very similar process. Good. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. So as far as participating in the development section, in the development section, we then start to plan as groups and teams. Senior management and authority level, different authority levels will be involved in the process. Subject matter experts and advisors will start to become critical. Workforce representatives, union leadership, those of you that work in a union environment, regardless of what we'd like to think, we have to keep the union leadership informed, even if they're not necessarily a decision maker. If you pop stuff at them without keeping them advised, you can have issues down the road. Higher headquarter and board representation and customer supplier representation are areas that are participants that have to be thought of when we're doing a development session. As far as senior leadership owning systems, strategic planning is the responsibility of the systems owner, whoever that is. The CEO director is usually a first line, or their first line reports are normally people that we anticipate are going to be system owners. Civilian presidents of companies, CEOs, department heads. In the military, they're often O6s or flag or general officers, are normally going to be the people that own a system, are responsible for a system. Those are the people that we have to get as champions to give us the authority to be able to, as we try to do that future state, current state, and we start talking about changing processes. These are the individuals in the clout that we have to have behind us to hopefully get the organization to cooperate with your activities. So these are the authorities to implement change and should be involved in the crafting of the strategic plan. If you can get them and involved in the actual strategic planning process, and in so doing, get them to give their input, but more important, get them to agree with the outcome. It'll save you trouble down the road when you have individuals who don't want to cooperate or don't want to go the direction you're trying to take it. Participants should be picked for their position, but sometimes the planning membership needs SMEs or future thinkers as well. So while we often create the teams to do these projects based on where they sit in the organization, there are people in almost all of our companies who may not sit in a specific leadership role, but either have a subject matter expert reputation, or they have a position of respect and authority within the organization, or they're the people that think outside the box and bring new ideas to the table. So when you're building your teams, you want to look at all of those potentials. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody on the team is going to be a high-level executive. You may have people on the team that are not. But again, when you do that, you have to also pick people that are willing to be part of the process and not be intimidated by the fact that the 06 or the president of the company is sitting in the room. So when you're considering that, developing and selecting that planning team, you have to be careful because they can be too large, and will not. If they are too large, they will not be able to have consensus or enough time for discussion. Because if you have a very large team, you tend to end up with too many opinions and too many people that want to make their statements. And if the powers to be are in the room, then you can end up with people who just are trying to make a name for themselves, and you just can't get to a consensus. You can't get to a endpoint because everybody's just doing too much talking. They can be too small, on the other hand, and may not have a sufficient diversity to have breakthrough or innovation or creative thinking. So it's a marriage. I can't give you an exact number. I can probably tell you 100's too big and 3's too small. What it is in between really depends on the culture of your company and the complexity of your project. In the past, when I've been doing strategic planning processes for very large multi-billion-dollar organizations, I've seen them use steering committees that usually are around 8 or 9 people that are the high-level group, and then have a working group that can be as big as 15 or 20. below it. Any more than that is probably going to be difficult. The membership should be mixed ranks and positions, and it may change as the discussion changes. So you may invite people in and out of the group based on what the discussion that you're having is regarding. Strategic discussion should be open, candid, and without retribution. It's one of the things that in an ideal world, you want to be able to have a communication with that top level individual and get them to agree that the subordinates have the ability and the authority to say what they think and believe and not worry about retaliation. And then that same sponsor needs to protect other members to ensure that, a middle manager doesn't take it out on one of his subordinates that makes a comment that he didn't or she didn't like. So there has to be some mechanism in place to ensure safety and candidness in the group. And there are different tools we can use if the topic is becoming so hot that you're concerned about controlling that environment. There are polling techniques that we use. For example, there's one called the Delphi approach, which basically you create a communication mechanism whereby suggestions are made and they move through the group, but there's no indication as to who originated the comments. It's a blind communication mechanism, and there are software packages that allow you to do this. And what they're designed to do is to let people make comments and suggestions so that people don't assess them based on who said it, but rather based on the merit of the words that are said. And then the only thing you as the participant have to be careful about is that you don't use terminology or phraseology that everyone can then tie back to you personally. But the point is that there are methods out there to ensure that retaliation does not occur. And then composition of the teams. Personality types, future thinkers, innovators, devil's advocates, all are types of people that you may want to encourage to be on the group. I have seen large corporations do a Myers-Briggs assessment to try and find people in the management team in particular who have personality types that statistically have shown have been willing to be more open-minded and cooperative as far as coming up with ideas. Also, there may be training programs that they'll put people through at the beginning of the process to help them understand how to be future thinkers and how to use critical thinking. Not everybody understands how to do critical thinking. One of the ones I have trouble with is what they call here the devil's advocate. It's one thing if a person is offering up a alternative idea simply because they're trying to get people to think outside the box. Then there's quite another if they're doing it simply because they enjoy messing with people. And people that do it just to mess with people or to cause problems or havoc, those are the ones that I don't appreciate. So devil's advocate is an area that I personally have heartburn with. I'm not sure that a true devil's advocate is actually making their comments for the good of the organization, but there are obviously exceptions. So this is intended for a little bit of humor. And sometimes when I'm developing things, especially when I was in the military, I sometimes wondered if we actually didn't have plans for making a plan. Okay. I hear everybody laugh, so you must have your mics off. All right. So let's look at organizational assessment then. So we talked a little bit about pre-planning activities. So what's organizational assessment? Organizational assessment determines the current state and potential strategic planning topics, issues, and necessity to determine the future state. So what we're doing at this point is we're sitting down and we're figuring out how are we structured, how does our process work today, and what are the problems and issues. So here, while we might have a problem statement in the back of our head because we work and live in the business, at this point we haven't identified what that is. We're still trying to, at this point, determine what is the current state of the art, what are the issues that we're having to deal with, and how do those issues impact our future state, or where we will be in the future, or want to be in the future. Future state here may be different than, say, the future state in your BBP. In your BBP, you were using the term future state to define the process and what it's going to look like when you complete your assessment, where you want it to go to. And that's consistent with what we think of in a strategic plan. But keep in mind, a future state in a strategic plan may be a location or a vision of where the company's going that is the vision of the leader, the CEO, the chairman of the board, whoever, that may or may not have any continuity to your current process. For example, that person you may be currently a plastic molding company, and he wants you to become a metal fabricating company in 10 years. So that future state has absolutely nothing to do with your current process. So it can be a little different than the one you're using for your BBP. In a strategic planning process, the future state is the vision that the top of the organization has for your company, for your organization. In the assessment phase, you're identifying and obtaining approval from all key contributors to be included in the assessment process. And some of those, and these are, in fact, stakeholders. So it could be your customers, current, future, or potential. You could be your workforce, sampling, cross-sections, the whole workforce. It could be your suppliers or contractors. It could be your union representatives. It could be your planning team members. It could be your headquarters. It could be your peers within the organization. It could be your financiers, the banks, the investors. It could be your stockholders. In the assessment phase, you're obtaining from all of those various groups their expectations, their desires, their anticipation of what they want from the organization. You're capturing all that. You're not trying to validate it. You're not trying to justify it. You're just trying to identify what they are so that you can see whether or not your future state plan addresses those. You then determine what historical performance-related documentation is available. So it could be the customer and employees' feedback. It could be process performance-related reports, such as your production reports and so forth, or any other planning documents that the organization's used in the past. So at this point, you're gathering all the data you can to show what the company's done or plans to do in the future, and then determine what research benchmarking might be necessary. So at this point, you're going to identify what secondary and primary research you need to acquire, whether or not you're capable of doing it, or you need to hire somebody such as a consultant to do it for you, whether you can acquire information by benchmarking. You're going to apply the benchmarking concepts. I don't remember, has your class already had your benchmarking course?
No, not yet, I believe.
Okay, then I'll leave the depth into that for you as it goes further. But one of the things that, if you notice, this is the very early stages of getting started in a strategic plan when you're doing the assessment. And this is when you're going to do the evaluation of benchmarking. The benchmarking course in your program is being moved earlier in the project for future classes, because right now it's toward the end of your program, and unfortunately, by the point you're taking the benchmarking course in your BBP, you should have already finished your benchmarking. So it doesn't apply itself for very effective implementation in your BBP. It's a critical part of strategic planning and project management, and it's something you will use in your real world environment once you graduate. So when you have that course, just remember that it belongs back here in the beginning. And in your BVPs, you actually should have done this probably in the first 2 classes to have had it at the right place. Benchmarking basically is where you look on the outside or elsewhere within your company to try and find out what the best practices are and what other people have done in similar situations to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. The philosophy behind benchmarking is why reinvent the wheel. If you can learn how to do it better from somebody else, then why not? There's nothing, unlike academics work, in professional work, there's absolutely nothing wrong with copying somebody. So there's no such thing as plagiarizing an idea in business. We do it and do it with pride. So that's the concept right here of benchmarking. Then, as far as individual groups, you're going to interview with key planning members is critical to the pre-work. So you're going to be interviewing all of your stakeholders. You're going to be interviewing the people that are on your team. You're going to begin to process the process of allocating, aligning thinking by asking questions of the different team members. You're going to start the process of ownership by collecting personal insights. So you're going to ask your team members how they see the problems after you've seen the data and stuff. What's their perceptions? You're not trying to make a decision yet. You're just trying to get buy-in and continuity. You're going to focus your group with select segments providing qualitative insights. So you're going to sit down and have brainstorming sessions, and you're going to try and get consistency of thought. You're going to draft questions appropriate to the group being assessed. So for customers, you're going to ask about changes in or anticipated requirements, satisfaction levels, where their satisfaction's not being met, expectations are not being met. In suppliers and contractors, relationships, ease of doing business with, ability to expedite order processing and bid processing. For employees, you're going to talk about work environments, motivation, skills and abilities, process, values, fairness, assessments. For leadership, you're going to talk about the vision, the mission, all the aspects that they manage, the things that they're responsible for. Those are the type of questions you're going to develop at this point when you can go out and interview those groups. You're going to consider systems, ask questions about every category of the Baldrige balanced scorecard approach to running businesses. And you're going to protocols such as anonymity, confidentiality should be established in the pre-planning phase and used throughout the process as appropriate for the interviewing of data. So what I mean by that is you're going to establish a protocol up front and make sure that everybody involved realizes that the information they give you is considered confidential and that it's proprietary, and that you're not intending to necessarily identify the individual that provided the information, but rather the category that they're in, and establishing a consistent program as to how you're going to protect confidentiality. If you don't do that early on and you compromise that going through the process, then people shut down on you and they don't tell you the things you want to hear. They tell you what management wants to hear. Then deliverables from the assessment. Information collected during the assessment that will be provided to the planning team either as a read ahead or during the planning section. So you're going to gather data that you can provide to the team as far as what are the evaluation assessments. What's the knowledge base that's been acquired? What's the background? Source documents that people can read so they can come up to speed on the process. Often transferred as executive summary levels in PowerPoint briefings to executive team members. So they'll often take all this information they've gathered and create high-level executive summary PowerPoints that they can give to management and give back to leadership on what you found. Generally, the first part of senior leadership session is that they review the input and establish clarity around comments and other assessment products. So normally what they'll want to do when you sit down with them and brief them on what you found from these interviews and from all this discussion, is they're going to want to talk about how did you gather the input, how did you ensure clarity, how did you put the comments together so that you didn't bias the results, because they're trying to make sure that what they're hearing is consistent with reality. Experienced consultants or design strategic planning experts typically facilitate planning sessions and coaching sections and educate the planning team members of various planning tools. So one of the things that at this phase often happens is that in the planning and implementation phase is where you would normally hire a consultant who comes in and trains your team up until you become experts yourselves. And make sure that you understand how to use the tools. They'll act as a facilitator. They'll normally manage the timeline for you so that you're not accused of being biased or whatever. And that's where a consultant could help. This is the function that in a sense, your BBPs are doing for the companies that you're and the organizations you're working for. You're acting as the consultant to do this on their behalf. And then this is an example of what an outline of what an assessment report might look like. In most corporate documents, start with an executive summary. The executive summary is normally the last thing you write in a report. So everything following this is done first. So you summarize who and what were assessed. You would have a section that talks about comments. And in the comments, you're going to organize by subcategories, and you're going to talk about missions, and core values. You're going to talk about the customers. You're going to talk about the financials, the organizational capabilities, human resource, learning, training. You're going to then show your SWOT or STEEP analysis that you did as a brainstorming activity as a team based on the data you collected, the key themes that came out of the research, the benchmarking and secondary research summaries that you found about your topics and about the company, and then the scenarios or business market analysis. In other words, a crisp analysis of the nature of the beast, the marketplace that you're operating within if you're a public company, and an assessment of your place in the marketplace. So you might in this thing be talking about where's the market going, that the top 3 companies in the market are X, Y, and Z. We are number 2 in the market. Our strategy to date has been to be a close follower. Our recommendation based on the direction and on the technology available to us that we should now move into a lead position in the industry. Those kind of comments would be in this section. And once you finish all that, you then go back up and write an executive summary. And an executive summary is about normally no more than a half page. And it is going to summarize at a very high level what is down in the rest of the report. It's designed so that a very busy CEO who doesn't have time to read 100 different reports can read that executive summary and see crisply what you are proposing. You don't rehash everything that's in the report. You normally give the highlights of what you found, and you're primarily telling him what you're recommending and why, or her what you're recommending and why. And the theory is that they could read that summary and be done with it, and they only read the rest of the report if they question your assessment or they want more details. They rely on their staffs and their direct reports to read the whole report and to make comments to them if they disagree with your executive summary. So that's kind of an example of what an assessment report would look like in a corporate environment. Any questions, or has anyone ever seen that type of a report in your work environment? Especially the executive summary? Okay.
We do, sir, in the military.
Okay. And so you're familiar with what the executive summary does and how it's structured then?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, they're very similar in a civilian environment as well, and you'll find that usually the The flag officer, the general officer, all they read is the executive summary.
Professor,
Yes.
is that the same thing as the BLUF?
I'm not familiar with that.
That's the bottom line up front.
Oh, yeah.
Bluff?
It's very similar, except from what I remember of that format. That's very, very crisp, is it not?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. This is normally going to be about a paragraph, about a half a page narrative, and so they serve the same function.
Okay.
This is going to be narrative in base rather than bulletized. It's going to be a very narrative type document. So this is what you're going to see, and this is what you're going to end up giving to a management team at the point where you're moving from the assessment into the implementation. This is what the executive officer is going to expect to see when he gives you approval to go on with the project. Okay. Both the military and civilian use a SWOT analysis in almost every respect that I know of. It's an analysis of strength, weaks, opportunities, and threats. Typically, strengths and weaknesses surface while compiling baseline data and looking at the internal processes, resources, and capabilities of the organization. Opportunities and threats tend to surface while conducting an environmental scan, listening to suppliers, customers, and external stakeholders. So while that's not always the case, that tends to be where they come from. In identifying the strength and weakness, consider those that are within the control of your organization. For example, if I was doing strength and weaknesses for my military command and I was in Southeast Asia, I'm not going to be showing a weakness, something that's going on in Europe. It's outside my focus. Same thing in a business. You want to keep it structured to where you're at. Reducing budgets, increasing skill levels are the type of things you're going to see. In identifying the opportunities and threats, identify the outside influences over which the organization has little control and explore how these will influence the mission. Using an affinity diagram is a very practical way to facilitate, discuss, and organize a SWOT analysis. So over here, what this is representing is it's representing a wall in a war room, and these are yellow slips, the sticky notes. And the way that you do a SWOT analysis, just in case someone hasn't done one before, is you'll have a facilitator who stands up and facilitates the meeting, and people throw out strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. It really doesn't matter. They throw out anything that they can think of about the topic you're talking about that falls into these categories. And the facilitator writes it on the sticky notes, sticks it on the wall. No one has to defend their point of view. Nobody has to justify it, and nobody has the right to criticize or to shoot it down. It goes on the wall. And you do that as long as it takes until nobody comes up with anything else. Once they're stuck on the wall like this, then the first thing and they're all going to be stuck together on a blank wall. Then what you would do is you'd have an area someplace, an easel, whatever, that has strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats on either side. And you would go note by note, and you would vote as a team and say, is this a strength, a weakness? Is it an opportunity? Is it a threat? And you move the sticky note to where it belongs. And then once that's done, you go back and repeat the process and break it down into strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats. And then once you've done that, then you start going in, then you go back as a team and you start going slip by slip, and you start assessing the comment as a team and deciding whether or not that comment is valid and whether it should stay on the wall or be removed. Strengths and weaknesses, again, tend to be more internal or oriented, have immediate impact, have short and long-term range implications, and may be short-term crises. So these are for internal. Externally, impact future impact of the organization, have long-term implications, and may not appear to be urgent at the exact moment. Are external oriented type threats. But the bottom line is we as a team evolve toward defining whether or not these are internal, external. Are they opportunistic? Are they threats? Are they strengths? Or weakness? If the majority of the team decides that one of them does not belong on the wall, it comes down. All of that, then you go back and you try to see if they can be grouped. Are there 5 or 6 that can fall into one single statement and be all cohesive? And you ultimately get to the point where you end up, hopefully, with strengths, 3 or 4 strengths or weaknesses, 3 or 4 opportunities or threats, and then we create the 4-squared triangle that you normally see in a SWOT analysis that you're probably all familiar with. And that's kind of the approach. It's a brainstorming tool. It's designed to allow people to think outside the box by the fact that you don't shoot down somebody's comments in the beginning. They get up there, and then once they're up, then you have an opportunity as a team to discuss it and validate it. Anyone have experience with the SWOT analysis? Have anything else they'd like to offer as observation or comment? Anyone? Okay, well, we'll move on. All right, there's also a steep factor, which in the steep factor, the word step or steep stands for social, technical, economic, environmental, and political. And these are other ways that we can classify and break down our approaches. So what we do here is we simply what we're trying to do is we're trying to categorize the factors that we deal with in some fashion so that we can look for common threads. So if we classify as a social factor, then it's cultural aspects, including health, consequence, population growth rate, age discrimination, career attitude, emphasis on safety. These would be things that are social in nature. By grouping things in the step approach factors, it allows often for us to find commonality between the factors, and that's all that this really gets involved in. It's another way of grouping them up into common buckets where you can deal with them with common results and common approaches. All right. In this particular case, how would you categorize these raw interview comments? Due to retirement and attraction, we will not be successfully training workforces in 3 years. We will not have sufficiently trained workforce in 3 years. And what they're trying to do here is go back here and say, is it a social, technical, economic, environmental, or political? And this basically would be a social. We can open up new revenues by expanding current product lines to international markets. So where would that fall on a steep factor? Anyone?
What was the question again, Professor?
We can open up new revenues by expanding current product lines to international markets. And then these are the categories: social, technological, economic, environmental, political.
Economic?
It would be economic, yes. So that's what these are intended. And we're not going to go through all of them. They're here. You can feel free to come back and take a look at them on your own time. But basically, what we're trying to do here is just help you understand that you could, if you had these kind of statements that came out of your surveys, and you were trying to group them in that SWOT analysis type of an approach, using this approach, you can group them into these 5 buckets. Once you group them into the 5 buckets, you then can look for commonalities and opportunities for improvement that focus on a political solution or on an environmental solution or an economic solution. And you'll find often that allows you to take some of your activities and to group them together into common factors. And then the other thing we do is we try to group our answers into different types of categories so that perhaps over time we can develop measurement tools to measure those results. So for example, the Baldrige balanced scorecard uses financial, customer related, operational, and people as 4 elements of the balanced scorecard. And so you could group all of those same questions into these 4 categories. And then what that does is then you then look for indicators that perhaps allow you to measure people problems in that balanced scorecard format. So then you may find 2 or 3 that relate to personal skills, and that's what they would do. So then there's the 7 Baldrige approaches. The same thing. You can group them into one of these 7 categories, and then you look for indicators in that category, and see how you can measure those going forward. And then what they're saying is that once you've grouped these kind of questions into either a step factor or into one of these 2 up here, the balanced scorecard or the Baldrige, you can then do a SWOT analysis on just the questions that are in that category. And then by doing that, you're focusing the discussion. Otherwise, you could end up with a whole wall full of stickers about questions and things that don't relate to each other. And all they're trying to do here is show you how you can develop categories and run multiple SWOTs, but have them relate specifically to subsets of the questions. Okay, and then determining the present state and other tools. Okay, based on the Huisman model, the following are tools that can be used to conduct analysis and determine the present state. And so we often use affinity diagrams or interrelational diagrams as one group. Another group is Pareto charts, histograms, scattered plots, and radar charts are another type of graphic presentation. And then tree diagrams and fishbone diagrams is a third category of tools that we can use to present the data that we find in a current present state assessment. The ones that are the most common are affinity diagrams and interrelationship diagrams, Pareto charts, histograms, and radar charts are probably the most common. We see tree diagrams and fishbone as well. Most of your projects are probably using the vast majority of these at some point in one of your courses. Fishbone diagrams are very effective at finding resolutions to problems. Tree diagrams are good at showing relationships. Radar diagrams are good for showing multiple indicators or issues on one chart. Scatter diagrams are great for looking for patterns in data that you can't necessarily see by looking at the numbers, but yet the chart will very easily show you the points that are out of the pattern. Pareto charts are used in almost all parts of quality management and business management, in that they allow you to find and work on the most critical issue first. And then interrelationship diagrams and affinity diagrams provide you with the ability to do things such as brainstorming and so forth. Anyone have any experience with one of these diagrams at their workplace that they have found it to be very effective?
We've done fishbone diagrams when we're trying to figure out if we had an escape or some sort of issue and what actually led to that. We're actually trying to find the root cause.
Hmm. And do you find them effective?
Definitely.
Yeah. Were they difficult for you to do initially, or was it a pretty simple process?
Well, thankfully, we got a little bit of help from someone who's actually one of the quality engineers that we work with,
Hmm.
who uses them on a great basis,
Hmm.
and she was able to walk us through and pretty much tell us, well, this is what you want to do with this, and this is why, and but it was a very, I think we got a pretty good training and how to effectively use it.
Good. There is and I may have it in the classroom. I don't remember if I've uploaded it or not, but there's a software, a very simple spreadsheet type software that is available to help you create those. And if it's not there, I'll make a note to upload it into your course material location because it would allow you to do the diagrams very easily. You just fill in the blanks and it creates the chart for you. So I'll look and see if it's not there, I'll upload it. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else? How about Pareto charts? Do any of you have experience in your plants, especially using Pareto charts or histograms? No? Most manufacturing facilities use Pareto and histograms. Histograms are very effective at showing uh, the levels, the proper production levels, and when you get outside of the specification standard. We use a lot of them in ISO type certifications. Okay. Next week, we're going to be talking about vision, mission, and core values and identity strategies. You'll be obviously working on answering the DQs. We'll be talking about coordinating with champion organizations, and you'll be working on completing the team assignment 1. And you'll be working on the final assignment throughout this course because the final assignment is a PowerPoint presentation that you will make in class yourselves. And basically, that's the material that we have for this week. Does anyone have any questions on anything that we've discussed tonight or up to this point in the course?
Hi,
No,
Professor.
sir.
This is Ron.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is Ron. I had a quick question. Would you recommend, or in your experience, is there such a thing as like strategic planning, like a pilot, or is it seen more powerful to be more uniform in a company to do everything all at once?
Normally, it's almost impossible to do a pilot strategic plan. You could do it at a divisional level, or at a if you had a plant that was operating independently, that didn't have other parts of the company that were doing the same thing, you could do one just for that plant or for that division. But it's very difficult to just do like one business line. The reason being that you have to do all of that pre-planning by your executive work, by your executives to give you the strategy and everything else. So what they could do is you could do the prior planning that's done at the executive level that we talked about earlier this evening, and then you could implement the operational part of it at a divisional level as a test. But there's so much of it that requires the work to be done up front that it's very difficult for you to just do a pilot. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, usually you do a pilot in order to get buy-in, but I guess that's where you were saying where benchmarking comes in, and that's kind of your pilot or your buy-in potential that you could serve up, right?
Right. Yes, and you could do like I said, you could do a divisional or a plant-wide pilot. But you'd have to start with all that strategic part up front as far as the plan. So you're going to be doing all that work regardless. All you're not doing is having all the plants and all the different divisions of the company doing it simultaneously.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
All right. So looking at the deliverables, we have. Let's see. You have the individual assignment 1.2 that's due for by week 2, and then we have for week 2 we have a team assignment, and we have 2 team assignments due, and they're both due. I'm just making sure they're due this week. Yeah, they're all. So you have 2 team assignments that involve your PowerPoints that are due for week 2. So that's what y'all are going to be working on for this week. So realize there are 2. You've got assignment 2.2 and you've got assignment 2.3 that are
Professor,
due. Yes.
I can't see it on my screen right now, but is that the correct syllabus for this class? We're in 548.
Let me look here and see. You're right. I grabbed the wrong one. I apologize. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. Or the system grabbed. Let me look here and see. 581 is what it is. Let me find it. Okay. Now let me pull it up. All right. So there's a team assignment 1, and it's due in week 3. So this week is just discussion forum and working on that team assignment 1, which is due in week 3. So you don't have. Thank you. It wasn't making sense because I didn't remember seeing that when I looked at it earlier today. So in this course, there's really only two assignments. There's a team assignment 1 and a team assignment 2, and then your individual discussion forum. So for week 1 and 2, you're working on discussion forums. The team should be currently working on the team assignment 1, which is due in week 3. And team assignment 1 is basically PowerPoint presentation slides, and I've got it on the screen right here. But it's creating the slide presentations that you're going to be presenting in week 5 in class. Okay, and what you'll be doing is providing that to me in week 3 for feedback, and then you'll be using that feedback to make any modifications and then the additions for the second part, which is due, it says week 5, it's actually due the last day of week 4 because you have to present it in class for week 5. Okay? So any questions about what's due for this week and for next week? All right, anybody have any other questions they want to ask me before we secure for the evening? All right, everybody's been quiet this evening. Okay, I've taken attendance. I see everyone that was here. It looks like everybody ultimately showed up. And I appreciate the fact that we had full attendance this evening. Keep in mind, there are a few of you that did not complete all of the deliverables for the discussion forum in week 1. And of course, those cannot be made up once we move out of the week. So I encourage you to post your primary message on time and your 2 peer messages before the end of the week. Because in this course, the discussion forum represents 35% of the points for the course. So you don't want to consistently lose those points because it's going to significantly impact your final grade. So please get your discussion forums in. If you're going to be traveling or you can't be in the class at the end of the week, then there's nothing stopping you from getting it in at the beginning. If you have a issue that's legitimate, get your answer in early, and if there's a problem that you're not going to be able to get to your peer messages because of something beyond your control, communicate that with me ahead of time and we'll work something out. Telling me after the week is over is I can't do anything about that. Once the week closes, I can't go back and change it. But up front, we can work something out. Okay? And if you're going to be traveling, I just recommend that you get the answer to your DQ in before you leave, so that if you have logistical problems, you've got the majority of the points taken care of. If no one has anything else, I'll stand by here in case someone wants to talk to me privately. Otherwise, you're free to go, and I'll look forward to seeing everybody in class and here live next Wednesday.
Okay, good night.
Good night.
Professor, you still on?
Yes, I'm still here.
This is Dave. One of our teammates told us that he was going to drop out, so I didn't know if that had gotten through to you.
No, who is it?
His name's Larry. He's not on. He wasn't in this week. I don't know if he was on the call last week, but he sent us a message during the week and said that he wasn't going to be in this class and he was going to not be in the remainder of the classes for the degree. So
okay, yeah. Matter of fact, he doesn't show up in the. He has not shown up in the course directory at all. So he's not. I never saw him. Was he? Hopefully,
okay.
Hopefully, it wasn't his employer that was your project. Was he?
No, it's mine. So we're good there. I just didn't know how that works. So we can definitely let the primary professor know that's how. Because when we post our stuff in the discussion forums, then his name won't be in it anymore. Not in the discussion forums for the overall presentation.
Yeah, he's dropped. He's been dropped from the course directory. I would just send an email to your lead professor. Let me just look here and see see if they've got him listed. I'm not sure. I don't remember who your lead professor was.
I can look it up because he was our first class.
Yes, if you go back to your orientation class, he'll be there, or your first one, and just drop him an email and let him know that he's dropped out.
Okay, I'll do that tonight.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too.
Sir, this is Judith.
Yes, Judith.
I was told that you had sent a couple of emails. It seems that I'm having issues receiving your emails as I use a Gmail address, not an ngs.edu address.
Okay.
That they have for me. And today, one of my teammates told me that you had sent a couple of emails with guidance on when to answer those DQs and so on and so forth. So,
because you didn't participate last week at all in the discussion, which means that you got 0 points.
Yes, sir. Because when I went on the site, I thought they had said even I was in there yesterday, and then I was looking at the timeline. It stated it was Wednesday midnight, so that's what I went with. And granted, I shouldn't have waited till the last minute, but I didn't.
Your answer to the DQ is due by Friday each week. You cannot. You're supposed to answer the question by Friday, and then you have until Tuesday midnight to post your 2 peer messages.
Oh.
And so the only thing you have to post your answer, and if you post your answer after Friday, I give you credit, but you lose points for tardiness. And then your peer messages, the class ends at midnight on Tuesday night, because Wednesday's the beginning of the next week.
Oh.
And then,
Okay.
and this is the way it should have been in all your courses. So the courses run from Wednesday to Tuesday. You have till Friday. So from now till Friday, you've got to, by midnight Friday, you've got to answer the DQs. There's 2 of them. And that's where you just
Yes, sir.
provide your first answer. You then have until till Tuesday midnight to post 2 more peer messages in each discussion forum. So if you go ahead and get that done for week 2 on, the amount of points you lost are not going to be significant. But you need to make sure you don't miss any more in the course.
Yes, sir.
So the ones for week 1 it's too late. But 2, 3, 4, and 5, you need to get those done in a timely manner.
Roger that, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
But that's what. Yeah. And is there a reason why you don't want to use the university email address?
No, sir. No, I just don't have. I know that I have an address, but I don't have my password that I need to establish again.
Okay. Well, if you call,
That's why I just kept using the Gmail address that I had originally.
yeah, the problem there obviously is that you're not. When I email the
I don't get it. Yes, sir.
classroom, you don't get it, and that's going to happen
Oh,
for the rest of the course. So you
yes, sir.
really
I will.
go ahead.
Yes, sir. I will. I will take care of it as early as tomorrow morning,
Yeah,
sir.
they can take care of it for you really quick, and then you'll be all set.
Yes, sir.
All right.
All right. Thank you. Have a
Thank
good night,
you.
sir.
You too. Good night.